I never know how to really describe it, except maybe I don't know. I don't know how to describe my work. It's like asking Miles, how does your horn sound? You know what I mean? He didn't really, I don't think he really tell you, you know? No, I hate to talk about piano. It's sort of on automatic, you know, most of the time.
Jean-Michel Basquiat spent the last 10 days of his life in August 1988 at his home in New York City. He lived at 57 Great Jones Street in a former horse stable in Manhattan's NoHo district, which he had purchased a few years earlier from his friend and sometimes rival, the late Andy Warhol. Basquiat had transformed the building into both a studio and a sanctuary, a place where he could work obsessively, surrounded by sprawling canvases, vinyl records, and walls layered with his trademark scrawls and jagged imagery that had made him arguably the greatest living artist of his time. Until recently, the loft had pulsed with creative energy and served as a hub of the downtown art and music scene, with friends frequently dropping by to see what the genius might be crafting next. Tourists and aspiring artists were always loitering outside, hoping for a sight of the elusive painter at work. But just beyond the front door, the East Village neighborhood still bore the scars of the 1980s. This was a decade before the gentrification that would replace bodegas with boutiques and tenements with multi-million-dollar condos. Crime in the area was rampant. Drug dealers posted up in doorways, and junkies lined the sidewalks in search of a score. The temptations were constant, and for Basquiat, often irresistible. Basquiat had been an addict for most of his adult life, and repeated attempts to get clean were mostly in vain. He confided in friends about his struggles, and they did what they could. Keith Haring and David Bowie both personally accompanied him to treatment centers, hopeful he might finally outrun his demons. He drank, snorted cocaine, and smoked crack, but heroin was the drug that held him tightest. Basquiat first began using heroin in the early 1980s, a time when he was rising rapidly to international fame. Friends recalled that his drug use escalated in tandem with his success, with the isolation of celebrity and the racial tokenism he experienced in the predominantly white art world compounding his dependency. He often painted for days at a time, fueled by drugs, pushing himself to exhaustion. Those close to him, like his former partner Suzanne Maluk and fellow artists like Fab Five Freddy, spoke of how Basquiat would frequently go through cycles of detox followed by relapse, sometimes within weeks. After Andy Warhol's death in 1987, Basquiat spiraled further. Finally, in early 1988, Basquiat made what would be his final effort to get clean. He traveled to Maui, hoping that the remote location, far from the temptations of New York, might help him break the grip of addiction. He stayed for months and remained committed to his sobriety at an inpatient treatment facility. While there, he painted, surfed, and took long walks on the beach. Friends who visited him said he appeared healthier and more clear-headed than he had been in years. He even spoke with optimism about the future, mentioning new projects and a desire to travel to Africa. In late summer, Basquiat returned to New York, clean and sober. But within a few days, his old habits returned. On the evening of August 11th, Basquiat left his building and walked down the street to a bodega where he met a slick-haired drug dealer named Alex, who Basquiat knew well. Basquiat handed the dealer money, in exchange for which Alex passed the artist a wax paper envelope with a sticky yellow substance inside. Basquiat returned to his apartment, filled a syringe with the heroin, and shot it into his arm. The next morning, August 12, 1988, Basquiat was discovered dead on his studio floor. Jean-Michel Basquiat was just 27 years old. I'm Jason Beckerman.
I'm Derek Kaufman.
This is Last Days, Jean-Michel Basquiat.
From one perspective, Basquiat's death, however tragic, was unremarkable. Another rich and successful young artist succumbing to the excesses of drugs and alcohol until it ultimately killed him. It was the same with Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, Brian Jones, Alan Wilson, Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain, and Amy Winehouse, each of whom, like Basquiat, died of addiction and overdose at the age of 27 and at the height of their respective careers. The recurrence of that number, 27, has turned into a morbid cultural symbol, a shorthand for the destructive intersection of youth, fame, and creative genius. But to relegate Basquiat to a statistic does a disservice to what he achieved and what he represented. Basquiat was more than a young man who burned out under the weight of his own success. He was a revolutionary presence in the art world, a black artist who dominated a space that had long been reserved for white, often elitist creators. In the early 1980s, when the contemporary art scene in New York was still rigidly gatekept by race and wealth, Basquiat, a black man from a working-class background, challenged both the aesthetic and cultural norms of the time. His paintings combined street culture with historical references and biting critiques of power structures. offering a voice that had been largely absent in mainstream galleries and auction houses. He did not fit the mold, and the fact that he succeeded on his own terms highlights his brilliance.
We've talked about this so many times, right? We've done Amy Winehouse, we've done Kurt Cobain, we've done so many people who died at age 27. We always ask the question, why? I mean, it's in one way, it's easily explainable, right? You have this confluence of you're still young and stupid, as we all were, but they are also insanely famous. People are always saying yes to them about everything. They're wealthy, and they just can't at that age kind of gather the wherewithal to be somewhat healthy with themselves.
And one thing you can't overstate with Basquiat is he was extremely handsome and on top of being extremely gifted as an artist. And when you're in New York in the 1980s and you have both those gifts at your disposal, the world's your oyster. I mean, he could date anyone he wanted. He was at the cutting edge of cool. He really was. His art is still vibrant today. And it's hard to sort of be still current as an artist when your art was, 50 years ago now.
I want to talk about that just for a second, just because as a tangent, and we'll get back to the sort of main theme of the pod in a second, but his relevance today is remarkable to me. I think he's as famous today. I mean, people like Jay-Z are really responsible for that. Jay-Z's bought a ton of his art.
Sure.
And my daughter, the reason I'm doing Basquiat is this podcast, because my daughter asked me to do him. She's really familiar with him and wanted to know who this guy was and what he was all about. And so, he is still really relevant, revered. And as urban sort of graffiti art has really become even bigger and bigger, it's all over town. He is the grandfather of it. I mean, it's odd to say the man who died of 27 is grandfather of anything, but he is the man who brought it to sort of the mainstream. And boy, was he incredibly talented.
He really was. And Basquiat's work emerged from the cultural underground of 1980s New York, an art scene that was in the last gasps of the avant-garde that dominated the 60s and 70s, and was now embracing punk, hip-hop, and graffiti. He first gained attention as Samo, a graffiti poet scrawling cryptic phrases across lower Manhattan. Basquiat described Samo as, quote, an end to mind-wash religion, nowhere politics, and bogus philosophy. Basquiat, in sum, was looking to change the way people thought about art.
By 1980, at just 20 years old, Basquiat was gaining notoriety in the mainstream New York art scene. He first appeared in the public eye with a cameo in Blondie's Rapture music video, thanks to his friendship with Debbie Harry, who also bought one of his early paintings for $200. It is worth untold millions today. By the following year, he was a fixture in the downtown scene, rubbing shoulders with celebrities and dating loads of young, beautiful models and musicians, including a then-unknown 23-year-old singer named Madonna, who Basquiat famously told friends was, quote, going to be somebody someday. His reputation as an artist was just getting going in 1981 when he first displayed a piece at a New York art show simply labeled Untitled. It is a striking, large-scale painting featuring a black skull-like head rendered against a deep yellow canvas in an almost X-ray-like manner, revealing internal structures such as teeth, brain, and eyes, all in bold, chaotic strokes. The painting caused a sensation on the international art scene and is today considered perhaps the defining masterpiece of contemporary art. In 2018, the painting sold for $110.5 million, at the time the most ever paid for a painting by any American ever. Among the painting's most ardent admirers was Andy Warhol, a legendary nonconformist in his own right, who quickly got an introduction to the young artist, and Warhol later said that from the very moment he met Basquiat, then just 22, he was captivated by his raw intensity and brilliance, both as an artist and a man. What began as admiration soon evolved into a deep and complex friendship, marked by collaboration and a shared defiance of artistic convention. Warhol called Basquiat, quote, the best artist alive and a true genius, while Basquiat marveled at Warhol's ability to live as himself unapologetically.
The two collaborated on numerous works between 1983 and 1985, blending Warhol's screen-printed logos and commercial imagery with Basquiat's raw, expressive painting style. Their dynamic was sometimes viewed as dependency and mentorship. Warhol offered Basquiat a powerful connection to the mainstream art world, while Basquiat injected new life and edge into Warhol's later career. And during those years, in large part due to his friendship with Warhol, Basquiat reached a level of mainstream and pop culture notoriety that placed him in rare company. He became a full-fledged celebrity whose name was uttered in the same breath as fashion icons, musicians, and celebrities. And by the mid-1980s, his fame had grown to such an extent that in terms of cultural visibility and myth-making, he was rivaled only by two other artists of the 20th century, his mentor Warhol and Pablo Picasso, both of whom, like Basquiat, became almost as famous for their outsized personalities as they did for their masterpieces.
There's one other note about Basquiat's relationship with Warhol, for what it's worth, the intimacy of the friendship and their constant public appearances together, coupled with the fact that Warhol was openly gay, really gave rise to a lot of persistent rumors of a romantic entanglement between the two men. There's no evidence of it, but they did spend, for a couple of years, basically every waking moment together. Basquiat was a well-known ladies' man throughout his adult life. We mentioned Madonna. He was often surrounded by muses, models, and rising stars. He was linked to several actresses, many of whom sort of went on to great fame and have kind of hinted at their relationships with him.
You could imagine in this art scene an era of like sort of sexual fluidity,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and I don't think this would be doing a disservice necessarily to Basquiat. I don't think he would have blanched if someone said like, how sexually adventurous and experimental are you? No one knows that. And he was quite the ladies' man, and he could have been completely heterosexual. But that was the thought at the time, that if you were in the art scene, like David Bowie and all the people he surrounded himself with were openly sort of pansexual.
But Bowie was 20 years of
Senior.
fame by the time that he sort of, everybody knew he was gay. I don't know how much of a risk. I mean, here's a black man trying to penetrate the white-dominated world of New York art in the mid-1980s. If he was also gay, I mean, Warhol got away with it, but I don't know that Basquiat would have. You know, maybe. I'm just speculating that maybe there was a real threat to him. The relationship he had with Warhol, and given that Warhol was openly gay, was intimate to a point, publicly intimate to a point that it's sort of like artists are weird people. We all love them for it. It was something that if you watch them in videos together, they never spoke, but they were often video together. There was a real love between these two men. And so,
but there was also a real power. There was also a very real power dynamic. Andy Warhol was hugely famous when Basquiat came into his life. He already had the Campbell Soup, paintings. He was a pop art phenomenon, and he had his whole scene. You know, he would make movies. Andy Warhol was a very big deal. So for Basquiat to gain entrance to that, you know, there could have been terms to go along with it. Like, this is all speculation. I do think there was probably a warmth and a friendship there, but there was also a very, very clear power structure. Over the next several years, as age and illness took their toll on Warhol, Basquiat became the center of the New York art scene, his exhibitions drawing crowds and critical acclaim both in the United States and abroad. By the mid-1980s, he was no longer simply a cultural phenomenon. He was the defining voice in contemporary art. His paintings, including Boy and Dog in a Johnny Pump in 1982 and Hollywood Africans in 1983, displayed a mastery of form. His art attacked the marginalization of black artists, elevated jazz musicians and black athletes to mythic status, and criticized capitalism and colonialism. Famed art curator Diego Cortez called him, quote, a genius in the true sense, noting his ability to synthesize disparate cultural references, ranging from Grey's Anatomy to bebop jazz to Haitian voodoo. An art critic, René Ricard, famously said his work displayed, quote, a rage that is just barely contained and an intelligence that is truly dazzling. But praise for Basquiat came at a heavy price. In a 1985 New York Times Magazine cover story titled New Art, New Money, Basquiat was presented as both genius and cautionary tale. Quote, a talented, troubled young man from the streets. Basquiat said he thought the article marginalized him as a black curiosity, instead of assessing his genius on its merit.
Indeed, Basquiat was, by any measure, a genius. In addition to his art, he consumed European classics and could discuss them in detail, read Grey's Anatomy cover to cover because he was fascinated by the human body, and then incorporated imagery from the book into his art. He spoke Spanish, French, and Italian fluently, recited beat poetry at length from memory, and read art history books for amusement. And his paintings reflect his encyclopedic mind. He used vague references to history, crossed out words and symbols from antiquity to form his own unique visual language. But the composition of his art, which might appear chaotic at first glance, is all highly intentional. For example, when once asked why he leaves crossed out words in his art instead of painting over them, Basquiat said, quote, I cross out words precisely so you will see them more. The fact that they are obscured makes you want to read them. Basquiat's immense fame brought with it enormous financial rewards, which Basquiat, unlike many artists, welcomed openly. He routinely sold his canvases for tens of thousands of dollars, a significant amount at the time for a living artist. And given that he frequently produced dozens of new pieces of art every year, he was able to amass a small fortune. Here is a very deliberate and probably wasted Basquiat in 1986 in one of the very few interviews he ever gave, responding to questions about the importance of money to him.
How important is money for you?
Oh, very important.
Like, how important?
Well, I've been completely without it before, so I know how important it is.
Does it give you freedom?
Yeah, it's like the closest thing to freedom.
And yet, the more Basquiat succeeded as an artist, the more he suffered. His meteoric rise brought with it intense pressure, alienation, and a growing dependence on drugs to cope. Thrust into the center of a predominantly white, elitist art world, he was often celebrated as an exotic outsider, yet rarely understood on his own terms. Basquiat felt that he was constantly being commodified by the white art world that saw his race as something to be exploited to increase the value of his art. His friend, the artist Keith Haring, said Basquiat, quote, was really sensitive to being used, and there's no doubt that he was exploited by the art market and by the people around him. Basquiat said, quote, I am not a black artist. I am an artist, a point which the wider art world never truly seemed to agree with. Regardless of the cause, whether rooted in trauma, pressure, or the isolating effects of fame, Basquiat got hooked on heroin in the early 1980s, and he was never able to truly kick the habit, which grew increasingly unmanageable in the final years of his life, especially after Andy Warhol's death in early 1987. And, Jason, there's this temptation to fold Basquiat neatly into this tragic narrative of just the tortured artist. But that would really obscure the forces that shaped his life and death.
Yeah, I mean, when somebody dies at 27 like this, we talked about earlier, we tend to sort of force them into the same mold as all these other great artists who have died too early. But I think his was different. The approach was different. The fact that he was this black artist trying to penetrate the white world, the fact that he was from this biracial household and this household in which multiple languages were all in a fully immigrant household. And then what really struck me was that he felt commoditized by the wider world. Like he wasn't just a genius. He was somebody that said, look at the great new black artists coming on the scene. And he resented that, not because he was at all ashamed of being black. As a matter of fact, his artwork is full of black iconography.
Yes.
But just that he didn't want to be thought of as just the great black artist. To his point, he wanted to just be the greatest artist of his time, which he arguably was.
Yeah, it's cringy to look at some of the archival material, and there's not much. He was a public figure for sure, but there's not a lot of video iconography. It's his art sort of stands on its own. But if you see some of these images and you know about that Andy Warhol relationship, there was this underlying exoticization, right?
Yes.
That's what they did. They sort of would bring Basquiat out as this shining example. They would never say he's just an important black artist. Though they were sincere in their love of his art, but the way that it was picked up and the way that he was sort of paraded around now looks cringy. It really does. We behave differently with racial issues than we did in the 1980s.
And there's this real sadness to his death for all the obvious reasons. But also, there was one quote that I wrote down. It wasn't just the loss of an individual. It was the rupture in the trajectory of American art. Because here's this groundbreaking fountainhead of new ideas from a different, who's different than the other artists who have come before, from well-heeled families or whatever. And his death sort of cut that so short. He could have been the guy, I don't know, the person who comes to mind is LeBron James. LeBron has accomplished so much, came from nothing, accomplished so much, and he's really given back. Started schools in Ohio and the whole thing. Basquiat could have been that guy for a whole group of sort of inner city artists who never would have thought to get into fine art and painting as their way forward. And it's shameful. It's too bad. I mean, it is what it is, but it's very sad that he wasn't allowed, didn't give himself the opportunity to achieve that.
Yeah, the other thing I always think about with Basquiat is even though he was so good looking and he was in the coolest scene in New York, he was deeply a sensitive artistic soul. I mean, when you read about how he was with languages, how well read he was, how he really studied history and really absorbed that world, he was a sensitive person. Yeah. And so to be in that environment where you feel commodified or you feel like you're treated like a sort of circus animal being brought to these parades of so
overstating
artists.
A little bit and maybe unfair, but the point is there.
Yeah, it's there. And I think he sort of wore all of that.
Yes.
He internalized a lot of it and then it affected his behavior. And since his death, Basquiat's reputation has only grown. His life story has inspired books, films, and exhibitions, and his influence can be seen across music, fashion, and visual art. And yet there's an irony in this posthumous recognition. The same art world that once dismissed him now uses his legacy as currency. His work, often centered on black suffering, rage, and resistance, is now sold at blue-chip auctions for tens of millions of dollars to the very same people who once judged him and who he once critiqued.
Basquiat constantly searched for refuge from his demons, whether through his friendship with Warhol, the scores of young women with whom he cavorted, or the months-long trip to Hawaii. But the only constant for Basquiat was his friendship with a small but influential group of artists, musicians, and writers in downtown New York who recognized his brilliance. Among them was Glenn O'Brien, a writer and art critic who became one of Basquiat's earliest champions and encouraged him to experiment outside the constraints of the institutional art world. O'Brien talked about his feelings of helplessness, watching his friend descend into a haze of addiction. But when he died, O'Brien chose not to rue the end, but to honor his friend and all he meant to so many people. He said, quote, "I don't consider his life to be unsuccessful because he died in his 20s. He was a brilliant success. He did more in his short life than most people ever do. Jean-Michel was a genius, not the kind of genius that is cultivated and trained in elite schools, but a true, raw genius, an electric mind that connected things others didn't even see. He was fluent in the visual and verbal languages of both the street and the gallery. He could talk about Gray's Anatomy and bebop in the same breath. He painted like he was breathing, spontaneous, vital, absolutely necessary. And for that and so much more, I loved him."